Given that Russia's special, short, sharp military operation has now lasted longer than the First World War, I think it's safe to say that the last few years of Russian offensives in Ukraine haven't exactly set any speed records. But having ramped things up slightly in 2025, going into the 2026 campaign season, there was a general expectation that, as in previous years, Russia would use the better weather to ramp up offensive activity. And so far, we've seen that kinda. There are places along the front where Russia has concentrated its traditional advantages in manpower and fires in order to make the Ukrainian defensive position extremely difficult and push forward. The city of Kostyantynivka, at the southern edge of Ukraine's Donbas fortress belt, probably stands as one of the most important and most high-profile examples there. At the same time, we've seen the Ukrainians fight a very different campaign, almost in parallel, focused on elements like deep strikes against the Russian economy, mid-range strikes against Russian military logistics, and trying to both stabilise the front where possible, while taking the initiative in part of Ukraine's south, and especially with regards to the politically sensitive Crimean Peninsula. And so today, as we reach the halfway point in 2026, I want to look at some of the current fighting in Ukraine and what it seems to tell us about the very different strategies being adopted by both sides. Some of the reasons the dynamics might have shifted compared to 1 or 2 years ago, and some of what we might expect to see in the coming months. To do that, I'll set some context for this campaign season and the tactics Russia has used in the past, and ask why the Russian offensive model might not be delivering the same territorial gains in 2026 that it did back in 2025. We'll then look at how the Russians appear to be potentially adapting that model to try and keep moving forward, with the city of Kostyantynivka serving as a case study. Then we'll switch over to look at some of what the Ukrainians are doing, including how some of the elements we focused on in previous episodes, long and middle range strike, combine together to build up this overall strategic model of Ukrainian defence. If Kostyantynivka serves as the case study example for the ways the Russians can make life very difficult for the Ukrainians, we'll use Crimea as a salient example of the way the Ukrainians are trying to return the favour. I'll then bring that all together to try and make some closing observations. But before we do that, I first need to throw to a sponsor. And so welcome back to today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Modern communication technology may have gotten so good that we can provide reliable high-speed internet to a flying lawnmower in the middle of the ocean, but that doesn't mean geography no longer matters in the digital environment. And so if you're trying to get the most out of a highly digitized realm, or look out for your privacy in a sometimes very fragmented digital environment, it might be worth giving a thought to some of the tools and practices you could want. The analogy I've sometimes used here is that just as a military platform might layer different active and passive defenses together, you might want to do things like be very careful with your credentials and browsing, maintain strict control of your devices, exercise a degree of skepticism whenever a random email requests your personal information, and also, in my case, you might use a VPN. With a click, what that can allow you to do is reroute internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, and also potentially alter how that activity is logged, because Private Internet Access advertise a no-logs policy and publish quarterly reports setting out that while they receive requests from authorities for user data, they don't have the ability to hand over something that doesn't exist. PIAs also advertise as being available cross-platform, compatible with a range of streaming services, and they allow your single subscription to cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you're interested, the link in the description will give you access to the 87% discount on a 2-year subscription to PIA plus 4 bonus months, allowing you to cover multiple devices with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So with my thanks to PIA, let's get back to it. So let's start by quickly going back to the start of the 2026 campaign season and a couple of things that have set this year apart so far. When we discussed the situation earlier this year, as in 2025 and 2024, it was pretty apparent that while things varied depending on where on the front line you were talking about, in general, Russia had the offensive initiative. Ukraine was capable of localized counterattacks in some areas and was scaling up its long-range drone effort, but based on precedent from 2025 and 2024, the general expectation was for a scaled-up Russian offensive. That was both because the weather was likely to improve, potentially making it easier to carry out offensive operations, but also just out of sheer political necessity. Russia is still a long way from its stated territorial war goals. Ukraine, shockingly enough, has been pretty adamant that they won't be handing over things like the Donbas fortress belt without a fight, and some commentators have openly theorized that despite the Ukrainian resistance, among everything else, Russian military planning is, to some extent, potentially partly hostage to a pair of factors. The military often appearing to convey the impression, both to the public and potentially Putin, that they've advanced further than they have, and so needing to advance in order to match up with the bullshit, while also making even loftier promises to the political leadership that with just that bit more additional funding, some more time, some more recruits, some more drones, etc., they'll absolutely definitely 100% be able to take these politically stated objectives, thus potentially salvaging this gigantic strategic sunk cost endeavour. Long before the start of this campaign season, though, there were reasons to suspect that wasn't true. And the Russian military just didn't have the resources or capabilities to cash the checks that its leaders might have been writing. And so far, the results we've seen from Russia in the first half of 2026, by many measures, seem to fall short even of what they managed to achieve in 2025. In territorial terms, for reasons we'll get into a little bit later on, Russian infiltration tactics, so far, just don't seem to be regularly delivering the same results that we saw back in 2025. At time of recording, based on just one of the open source mapping tools, Russia's net territorial gain for the month from May to June 2026 was about 10 square miles, less than half the size of Manhattan Island. Another source which tends to be more bearish for the Russians, the ISW, actually had Russia at a net negative for that period. For what it's worth, I'd come down on the side of Russia still advancing, albeit at an absolutely glacial pace. But it's clear, at least so far, we haven't seen any kind of across-the-board sledgehammer offensive. Instead, Russia's military attention appears to have often been slightly more focused. The Donbas is very obviously still a key military consideration, with the fortress belt city of Kostyantynivka arguably serving as a bit of a case study. Meanwhile, we've seen Ukraine fighting a very different campaign with different apparent objectives, but before we get to that, I think it's worth examining first why we might see the Russian model having more apparent difficulties now in 2026 than it has in previous years. While things can obviously vary a lot, time to time, place to place, commander to commander, I think a very high-level observation supported by the data is that Russian offensive tactics have gone through a couple of stages of general evolution in this war, especially in the beginning, but also out through battles like Vuhledar and even sometimes around Pokrovsk. Massed mechanized assaults, so columns of armored vehicles, were fairly common. Those, however, suffered very, very badly because they were easy to spot using observation drones, vulnerable to some of the prevalent systems of the conflict, suffering especially badly from remote laid mines, and they obviously created a very high churn in equipment stores. If you're YOLOing a bunch of tanks on the regular, you're going to lose them on the regular. Putting more focus on dismounted infantry assaults then reduced the vulnerability armour and made these attacks harder to spot. But even relatively early on, organised formations of infantry in the open often proved attractive targets for one of the deadly combinations of the war in Ukraine, the spotting ISR drone and the artillery. Artillery can fire in any weather, and especially with things like DPICM cluster ammunition, it often didn't take that many cannon rounds in order to potentially break up an infantry attack and inflict significant casualties in the process. And anecdotally, I'll leave a source in the description, there's at least one battle I think that demonstrates that effect. Remember those North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians that for a while many pro-Russian sources denied existed? Yeah, well, we're now at the point of their contributions being openly acknowledged and celebrated by both Moscow and Pyongyang, and we know more about some of their initial fights. Reportedly, in some of the early engagements when North Korean infantry was sent against Ukrainian positions, it corresponded with the Russians, remembering this is over Russian territory, putting up a whole bunch of ISR drones. What that meant is that a lot of the Ukrainian artillery were understandably nervous to open fire, because if you reveal yourself by firing from your hot position while an ISR drone can see you, then that's basically an open invitation for a strike drone to come your way and try and dig you out of it. With limited Ukrainian artillery in play, North Korean tactics didn't generate unacceptable casualties, at least by their standards. Things like bomber drones and automatic grenade launchers could inflict some casualties, but if you have physically fit, motivated infantry on the attack with a high casualty tolerance, then that may not be enough. Reportedly, though, when conditions shifted and the artillery was able to fire more freely, North Korean casualties spiked, results fell off, and their tactics subsequently had to adapt. That's only one anecdotal example and expressed in very general terms, but I think it highlights a broader point here. While we talk about drones being the overwhelming driver of casualties in Ukraine, which they currently are, and artillery having been pushed back to more of a secondary role in terms of casualty generation, I think it's important to remember that partly things are that way in the first place because the combination of artillery and spotter drones was so devastating that tactics had to adapt to counter it. What the Russians came up with to both prey on Ukraine's weaknesses and also try and minimize Ukraine's strength in that responsive drone-corrected artillery fire were infiltration tactics. To oversimplify, instead of sending a platoon of blokes to try and take a position, instead you send a platoon of blokes in ones or twos, one group after another, and you encourage them to try and advance and dig in somewhere behind the Ukrainian frontline positions. The Russians, for lack of a better term, could almost play this like Minesweeper, exploit the relatively porous Ukrainian frontline positions to send a group forward, and if they hit a point of resistance and didn't make it, route the next one slightly differently until they start to filter through. Images like the one you see on the right there, which is released by the Russian MOD, illustrates a little bit of how this kind of thing can work. You just have a pair of Russian infantry in that case, being shadowed by a drone, making their way into a building, a sheltered position, where they can presumably be resupplied by cargo drops from other drones, potentially create some havoc and panic in the Ukrainian positions just by knowing they're there, and then eventually if enough Russian infantry manage to accumulate, you have a force that can actually undertake assault actions. This kind of thing minimised the artillery problem, both because these teams are harder to spot, and also because, frankly, in a lot of cases, one or two guys isn't worth the expenditure in artillery shells necessary to eliminate them. Hence, much greater emphasis being pushed onto things like FPVs in the drone force to try and deal with them. Obviously, handfuls of infantry with small arms don't have a bunch of organic firepower, but the Russians came at that problem from another angle. They still employed significant amounts of cannon and rocket artillery, they integrated glide bombs in ever greater numbers to try and blast apart Ukrainian defensive positions, and they started using longer-range loitering munitions and strike drones to eliminate positions, go after Ukrainian artillery, and also put pressure on supply lines. This was never a recipe for very rapid operational scale advances or limited casualties among the Russian infantry, but for a while it was a combination that seemed to work. We saw plenty of variations, like the integration of motorcycles and light vehicles to get the advancing infantry groups moving faster, and the improved Russian drone tactics of groups like Rubicon also made an impression. The question then is, if Russia still has all those ingredients available, what might have changed? And why the same or improved tactics applied in 2026 aren't delivering the same results they did in 2025, but instead less territory gained and greater claimed casualties. Based on what we've seen reported about this campaign season so far, a couple of elements might be coming together. Ukrainian monitoring of the front line generally seems to have improved, making it harder for infiltration groups to make it through undetected. And in turn, Russia's ability to get reconnaissance and strike drones deep behind Ukrainian positions appears to have gone backwards. We've talked in conceptual terms about the impact of Russia being largely cut off from Starlink or Ukraine rolling out greater numbers of interceptor drones. But to add to what the Ukrainians have been publicly claiming, there's some data from the Russian side that might give us a bit of a clue as to what's happening. What you're seeing here is data from Lost Armor, essentially a Russian version of Oryx or Warspotting. They notably only track visually confirmed Ukrainian losses, not Russian ones. But when we're interested in the claimed effectiveness of Russian forces, they do have a couple of interesting data sets. The chart you see on the right there is for claimed hits month by month of one of Russia's more exquisite loitering munitions, the Lancet. Over time, these things have been produced in greater numbers, usually handed over to relatively elite operators, and also given a variety of new features, better guidance, larger warhead, and also a claimed significant range extension in a lot of models. And so if nothing else had changed, you'd generally expect technical upgrades and greater production to lead to a larger number of hits over time, and for a while, that is what we saw. The chart you're seeing there doesn't just record hits, it includes damaged, destroyed vehicles, but also misses in cases where there's no footage to confirm the result. But the overall pattern is that apparent usage grew rapidly between 2022 and 2023, and then again between 23 and 24, and then started to first flatten out, and recently declined to levels close to what we were seeing back in 2023. Even then, some of those recent hits are actually multiple engagements of the same target. This section of road I was looking at, for example, showed 3 strikes, which are actually 3 engagements of the same Ukrainian self-propelled gun. And of the 4 most recent videos in the dataset, 3 are of repeat engagements of the same Ukrainian target. But the key element we should be interested here, I think, isn't data methodology, it's distance. If you look at the section of the front we're talking a lot about today, for example, a lot of these hits have been on frontline targets. Many now technically in Russian-controlled territory because they took place back when it was Ukrainian-controlled. To give you a sense of scale, some of the deepest strikes here that I've circled on the map on the right there is where you're in the territory of a counter-battery hit against cannon artillery. And a disproportionate share of the Ukrainian artillery systems we're seeing hit, either by longer-ranged FPVs or loitering munitions like Lancet, are these shorter-ranged ones. About half of Ukraine's visually confirmed SPG losses for the year are the shorter-ranged 122mm 2S1. Suggesting Russian UAS might be much more dangerous to Ukrainian artillery closer to the front than it is to longer-range systems firing from further back. The observation here is while there was a lot of concern of Russia ramping up mid-strike activity towards the tail end of 2025, this year we've seen very intense activity, especially within a couple of dozen kilometres of the front. But between Starlink interceptors and other factors, that mid-range threat just doesn't seem to have developed in the ways the Ukrainians feared or managed with their own systems. It also appears to be that many Ukrainian units are just getting more familiar and also comfortable with these Russian tactics, for lack of a better term. especially early on in the Russian usage of these tactics, or more recently where these tactics are being used against units that might not have been exposed to them before. Ukrainian units finding out they had pockets of Russian infantry in their rear might have had a significant emotional response to this news. Over time, though, some Ukrainian units got more used to that kind of situation and seemed to subscribe more to the Chestipula school of thought when it came to being surrounded. The understanding now often seems to be that the grey zone is the grey zone, positions might be intermingled, and if you do find out or suspect that you have Russian infiltrators in your area, you hold your position, maybe readjust your logistics, and then set about trying to get them cleared where possible. Speaking of which, we've also seen some tactical adaptation from the Ukrainians in terms of how they deal with infiltration. It's not uncommon to see footage of Ukrainian drone units trying to hunt down small units of infiltrators, for example, and there are also some usually higher-end Ukrainian units, like reconnaissance units, that have increasingly pivoted away from being reconnaissance units, given how much of that is now done by the drones instead, to instead be more dedicated clearing or anti-infiltration units. Ukrainian military reforms, including the switch over to the core system, likely helped, as did some of those aforementioned approaches to better dealing with infiltration teams. What this might capitalise is that individual infiltration teams just don't have a lot of combat power. They're at the end of a tenuous supply line, there's only so much equipment they can personally carry, and if they can't cause panic because the enemy is used to their presence, can't ambush supply lines effectively because they have to keep their heads down because the drones are hunting from them regularly, and can't accumulate because clearing operations happen before they can do so, it just becomes harder for them to deliver military results. There's also a final point to be made, I think, about logistics adaptation, because another component of the Russian model wasn't just heavy fires like glide bombs and infiltrating infantry, it was also trying to choke off supplies to forward Ukrainian positions to force an eventual withdrawal. To be clear, especially in some places like parts of the Donbas we're talking about today, Ukrainian logistics are still very dangerous. But as you can see on the right there, filmed on the road to Kostyantynivka, the Ukrainians do appear to have invested a lot in trying to make it at least somewhat safer. Drone netting over vital supply roads, light vehicles, in that case electric scooters to help troops move more quickly, a lot of major logistics activity like evacuations commonly taking place in bad weather, and also, as hinted by the UGV in the background there, also more drone-centric logistics. A simplified caricature of Ukrainian logistics in a contested area, for example, might look something like this. The trucks can carry a lot of supplies, but they don't try and get it as far as the front line. Instead, they take it as far as a UGV position. The UGVs, which might struggle with an FPV swarm but probably aren't worth targeting for something like a Lancet or a fancy version of the Molniya, also don't carry the supplies to the front line. Instead, they only take it as far as a heavy drone position. These heavy drone positions are very supply intensive. They need a lot of munitions for their bombers, for example, batteries and other supplies. But what they can then do is carry the limited supplies needed by the frontline infantry, so mostly food, water and ammo, and drop those to supply forward positions, so you don't have to run the UGVs or the trucks all the way up to a frontline trench. Now, that sounds great, but it both isn't universal. You'll still see Ukrainians in videos using things like handcarts, for example, or heavy rucks to move supply on foot. And it also falls over if you want to move the kind of cargo that can't readily be carried by a rotodrone, in particular, medical evacuation, which all helps feed into the general observation we've seen this year, which is similar Russian tactics, delivering relatively fewer territorial results, without a commensurate fall-off in Russian casualties. And speaking of Russian casualties, I also think there's one note to make here about the relationship between tactics and some of the reporting we've seen about it. For understandable reasons, casualties have always been one of the most contested things to estimate in this war, and alongside that, another contentious point has been the ratio between killed and wounded. Within that, for a while now, we've seen a number of sources claiming the gap between Ukrainian KIA and Russian KIA is significantly wider than the gap in casualties in general. That is, a wounded Ukrainian soldier is significantly more likely to survive than a wounded Russian one. Recently we saw the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, make a statement during a Senate hearing where he suggested that for the first time, the Pentagon was assessing that Russian killed in action was starting to outnumber the wounded. Quote, "The number of Russian fatalities has exceeded the number of wounded, so the Ukrainians are not only fighting bravely, they're fighting effectively." End quote. Now, if that estimate is anywhere close to true, by historical standards, it would be absolutely remarkable. We are talking medieval standards of battle wound survivability. Even in the pre-penicillin era World War I, wounded on the Western Front well outnumbered the killed. And so, of course, instantly you'll see pro-Russian sources come out and say these ratios can't possibly be anywhere close to correct, and because of a disparity in firepower, they'd actually expect the Ukrainians to have a worse killed to wounded ratios than the Russians. Alternatively, you might see more pro-Ukrainian sources taking these claims pretty much as a given and saying they prove that Russia has no military medical system to speak of. But one important factor to consider there is where both sides' casualties are likely to be suffered. A lot of Ukrainian casualties are taken by support elements like drone teams or logistics troops or rotating forces behind the front line. If they are wounded, those might have a relatively reasonable chance of medical evacuation and treatment. In terms of Ukrainian infantry casualties, given that a lot of the time they're going to be the ones defending, at worst, a casualty is going to be taken in a frontline position, a trench, a basement. And if that happens, make no mistake, medical evacuation is going to be very, very difficult. You might have to move an individual back on foot several kilometres, potentially wait for bad weather until a UGV or a vehicle can come up to take them the rest of the way. But with infiltration tactics, think for a moment about where Russians are likely to be hit. In order to carry out infiltration attacks, Russian infantry by necessity have to expose themselves. They have to head forward. And if, as in the majority of cases, their luck eventually runs out and they are hit, the two places it's likely to happen are either in the no man's land grey zone or behind Ukrainian lines. If infiltration is already a difficult, high failure rate exercise for troops that are in fit fighting condition and fully mobile, a bloke who's just copped a whole bunch of frag from a drone drop munition probably isn't going to be able to run a couple of 7-minute miles, making it back to their own line for treatment. It's not likely that a wounded Russian is going to find 4 colleagues with a stretcher to pull him out of there. And to compound it all, you have to remember that demographically speaking, these are some very old armies. Your average 19 or 20-year-old might not be nearly as indestructible as they think they are, but in comparative physical terms, they are close. And they might handle a long march while wounded a lot better than someone with pre-existing conditions in their 40s or 50s. This is something I think that is sometimes glossed over about the manpower-intensive nature of infiltration tactics. Yes, the fact you're using small groups primarily is going to constrain your casualty rate somewhat, but losses in percentage terms are likely to be very high, and of those losses, you'd expect a relatively high proportion killed. So if some elements of Russian infiltration tactics aren't delivering the same results in 2026 that they might have in 2025, what about the flip side? What about some of the elements that still seem to work some of the time? We've seen that sometimes, for example, using bad weather to cover offensive activity still works. It might restrict drone teams on both sides, but not friendly artillery, for example, that can still fire on known enemy defensive positions and provide an opportunity for resupply or troops to try and move forward. Russian glide bombs remain painfully effective for Ukrainian defensive positions, and the old approach of using large numbers of drones to try and create localized logistic squeezes on Ukrainian forces, problematize rotation and resupply, as well as critically go after Ukrainian drone teams to try and suppress their activities, also can work. Russia has continued to scale up its drone forces, both in terms of personnel quantity and the production of things like FPVs. They've introduced new types, new tactics, continued to test and adapt doctrine on how drones should be used, with the net result that while they might be behind in some areas like interceptors and mid-strike, especially in certain sectors, they can create absolutely dismal conditions for Ukrainian logistics and defending Ukrainian troops and drone operators. And the net result is that especially in cases where Russia is focused and able to take the time, conditions for Ukrainians defending a particular sector can become very, very hard. The bloke on the right there, for example, briefly interviewed as part of a recent documentary, is rotating out of a forward Ukrainian position after 93 days. For comparison, during the First World War, a British Tommy in the trench might expect to spend maybe 3 to 6 days right up on the firing line, with additional time spent in the support trenches or reserve lines, and fairly regular rotations out of the trench system entirely. But as we've said repeatedly in the past, rotation in Ukraine, especially in the most intense sectors, is just so dangerous that forces can't do it as often as they might like. And that interview was with troops pulling out of perhaps one of the most intense sectors of the front. Let's talk about the battle for Kostyantynivka. While there's increasingly now an entire Ukrainian fortification system behind it, Ukraine's so-called fortress belt cities are still a key element of their defence in the Donbas. The northernmost section of the belt had the largest pre-war population, centred on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, with this particular city, Kostyantynivka, serving essentially as the southern tip. As you can see, compared to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, it's significantly further south and also the furthest east, meaning that, as illustrated by that somewhat older map on the right there, it kind of juts out from the rest of the defensive position. The main G-lock, primary supply line for Kostyantynivka for some time now, has basically been a single road that connects the city to Druzhkivka, which you can also see mapped on the right there. The before and after you can see on screen here compares a relevant section of the front on the 1st of January 2026 to roughly 6 months later. As you can see, in many places, the Russian advance has been broad but incremental. After taking Siversk, for example, grinding closer and closer to Mykolaiivka. Other areas like the zone around Chasiv Yar have comparatively barely moved, but Kostyantynivka has found itself wrapped in the proverbial grey zone. As with so many urban agglomerations the Russians have had to butt their heads against, rather than just being able to storm the place, the Russians have steadily made it harder and harder to hold. Russian drone operators have tried to make it harder to resupply. Russian infiltration teams have moved further and further around the town and even into the city itself, creating a steadily larger grey zone that makes it harder for the Ukrainian defence to remain cohesive and for its supply lines to be kept intact. In a recent documentary I'll link down in the description, some rather brave journalists decided to take that last road from Druzhkivka towards Kostyantynivka. And even based on just some of the images and footage they took, I think there's plenty of evidence to point to how this Russian approach can play out. For example, along that supply road, you'll see plenty of examples of vehicles that have clearly been struck at some point, with the near omnipresence of massive anti-drone cages pointing to where their operators probably saw the threat coming from. Likewise, along a lot of this road, you'll see the Ukrainians having set up extensive anti-drone defences. Netting, for example, is extremely common, and you'll also occasionally see Ukrainian mobile fire teams along the road. Small groups of infantry tasked with trying to shoot down Russian drones when they appear. Outside of some rarer cases and opportunities like bad weather or low light, as you get closer and closer to frontline positions in the city, supply vehicles start to become rarer and rarer. Instead, you see things like this: dismounted troops pushing cargoes in handcarts, on the understanding that, especially at longer ranges where Russia has to primarily operate more expensive and more exquisite drones and loitering munitions, a single bloke with a cart, especially one who can rapidly scatter into the trees, might not be considered a worthwhile target. You'll also see plenty of stuff like this, destroyed logistics UGVs by the side of the road, which I think emphasises the point that these small cargo carriers should be as cheap and attritable as possible when used in these kind of areas, because in that case, even when they're destroyed, they might still be doing their job. A single unit might be able to carry more than several infantrymen, and each one that cops a drone might be a Ukrainian infantryman that doesn't. And if you look at some of the comments made on camera by Ukrainian troops rotating out of those forward positions, from our perspective, there are two main observations that immediately stand out. One, to put it politely, no one has a single nice thing to say about the situation in the city itself. No one's breaking, but everyone pretty much agrees the situation absolutely sucks. The second thing to note, in line with a trend we've seen much more broadly, is that equipment choices seem to be very much mirroring the omnipresence of the drone threat. In an infantry section, you might have a couple of blokes with the standard assault rifle, but one member of the section at least with a shotgun. This bloke apparently took that idea even further by adopting the Call of Duty approach of carrying two primary weapons, so he could rapidly switch between the AK and the shotgun. This is not something Ukrainian troops are likely doing, because carrying several kilograms of additional weapon system and ammo is character building. They do it because even though a lot of the recent media attention focuses on Ukrainian innovations in the drone space, the Russian drone force and the supply of things like FPVs in particular are massive and dangerous. At time of recording then, there's a lot of uncertainty around exactly how things are right at the front, but based on what we've seen come out in the open source, I think the following is broadly what's likely. You now have a situation where both Ukrainian defenders and Russian infiltrators are mixed together in the city itself. In quantitative terms, especially closer to the city, Russian drones have a quantitative advantage, and it's already become very difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply, rotate, and reinforce those forward positions. Based on past precedent, I think the most likely expectation is that eventually Russia will be able to push the Ukrainians out from Kostyantynivka. At that point, the city will initially still be in the grey zone until Russia can bring more and more elements like drone operators up, push the kill zone back, and try and establish the momentum and conditions necessary to push further forward. That's obviously not a certain outcome, but based on the way the last couple of months have gone, it does seem like the most likely at this point. The reason I bring all of that up is because it arguably serves as a bit of a microcosm of what the Russian offensive looks like in 2026. And within that, there's bright sides for both Moscow and Kyiv. From Moscow's perspective, it arguably demonstrates that when the Russians focus their efforts, focus their assets, that combination of fires, drone teams, and infiltration tactics can still problematize and unravel even sometimes very strong Ukrainian defensive positions. And if they are able to overcome the city, it might set the stage for some further advances. It would arguably demonstrate that, at least here, Russia was able to take an objective in the Ukrainian fortress belt proper. On the flip side, from a Ukrainian perspective, this battle is generally accepted to have started around October 2025, suggesting it's taken the Russians the better part of 8 months to not entirely take this objective. which if you extrapolate out, might bode well for Kyiv's ability to frustrate Russian ambitions in the Donbas for a long, long time. My key point here isn't the current iteration of Russian tactics can't deliver results. It clearly can, but at a rate and level of investment that raises more than a few question marks. Going forward then, what are some of the things we've started to see or might see in terms of further Russian adaptation? For starters, we've begun to see attempts and are likely to see more attempts to mitigate some of Ukraine's relative military strengths. Middle strike drones going after Russian logistics are a big one that we'll come back to when we talk about Ukraine properly in a moment. But we have anecdotally already started to see more cases like the one on the right there, where you have a Russian logistics vehicle that isn't just relying on electronic warfare, which isn't a reliable solution when you're dealing with drones that might have AI terminal guidance, and instead some kind of actual hard kill protection. In the case on the right, that takes the form of a technical, so a bloke with a machine gun on the back of an escorting vehicle, who in that case isn't able to successfully intercept the incoming Ukrainian drone and decides to leg it at about the 600-metre mark, but I think it's likely that Russian efforts in this area are much more likely to scale up than they are to peter out. Secondly, historically we've often seen Russia try and imitate areas where Ukraine gained success, and so a greater Russian emphasis on trying to duplicate or replicate or build on the Ukrainian mid-strike success seems like a relatively safe bet. As a recent example, we have seen a number of Russian mid-range strikes against Ukrainian gas stations, presumably in part since those are both logistically important, but also don't require the kind of dynamic targeting capabilities that something like a truck or a train might. In terms of the actual UAS and loitering munitions themselves, they already have some reasonable platforms with a lot of legs. The problem likely isn't going to be developing a weapon system equivalent to something like the Hornet or the FP2, but instead compensating for the advantage the Ukrainians have in terms of affordable, reliable long-range communications, namely the fact that they can use Starlink. The first 16 satellites in the so-called Razvet constellation were launched on March 23rd, and while one of those satellites saw its orbit deteriorate and is believed lost, 15 remain in orbit. Each Razvet 3 satellite weighs about 370 kilograms reportedly, and while you're definitely not going to get regular sustained connectivity with 15 satellites in orbit, they're clearly trying to build up. And on what I'm sure is a completely unrelated note to this and other Russian space-based capabilities, we also saw 2 cases of Ukrainians going after a comparatively new target type, namely Russian space communication and control centres. On the 22nd of June, Russia's largest space communication centre, the Dubna facility around Moscow, was struck by Ukrainian one-way attack drones. As you can see on the right there, satellite images suggest that resulted in a couple of holes being put in buildings at the complex, which I'm sure did absolutely no damage, given space control centres are famous for not containing any sensitive electronics or components. Later that same week, on the 24th of June, another facility, this time in the Vladimir region, was also struck by Ukrainian one-way attack drones, and as you can see, is looking slightly worse for wear, because while we can't be sure exactly what the interior of that facility looks like, I'm fairly confident that primary satellite dish is going to need more than a roll or two of duct tape. These facilities were very clearly deliberately included in a Ukrainian target list, and someone made the decision to dedicate drones against them. And while it's always possible that might have been just because they're considered generically valuable or to push the Russians to better defend them, I'd suggest it might provide one point of evidence the Ukrainians do regard Russian space capabilities as relevant to the war, and are keen to try and mess them up if at all possible. The final point is it seems increasingly likely that either in the second half of this year or early next year, Russia will have to do something about its manpower position. Even leaving aside Ukrainian claims for a moment, Russian data suggests that the rate of recruitment into the military has slowed. At the same time, we've covered some of the very ambitious plans the Russian military has announced in terms of scaling up its units, and especially dramatically increasing the size of its unmanned systems force. Just from a mathematical perspective, I'd argue in that kind of scenario, something eventually has to give. You can't rely on manpower-intensive infiltration tactics while also scaling up your conventional maneuver units, while also scaling up the drone force, and somehow provide for the entire thing using a diminishing source of recruitment. Now, whether that takes the form of a new system of incentives or alternative sources of recruitment, or some kind of overt or covert additional mobilization, we don't know. The point is, by Russia's own numbers, the manpower math no longer works. And so I think it's likely that at some point, after kicking the can down the road some more, something or several things are at least attempted to try and balance out that equation. Which gets us to the Ukrainian side of this campaign. Because while I've been very comfortable saying over the last several years that Russia clearly has the initiative on the battlefield, at this point, it's a little bit murkier. Russia is clearly in a position where it has the resource advantage and is able to pick its offensive battles, but Ukraine has also very clearly demonstrated that it can pick more than a couple of fights of its own. One thing we've sometimes seen with Ukrainian battles in the past, but arguably not as much this year, is the Ukrainians pouring resources into defensive battles, grinding it out around a point that the Russians effectively choose. Bakhmut was arguably the classic example here, with the Russians and especially Wagner designating it a key objective, and the Ukrainians dedicating a lot of resources to holding it, arguably longer than it made military sense to do so. What we're seeing now, though, is arguably more a case of Ukraine trying to, in strategic terms, fight around the problem. A lot of resources still do get dedicated to defending against whatever Russia's offensive focus at the moment is, but plenty of other assets are dedicated to fighting a very different kind of war. One that tries to do things like leverage long and middle-range drone strikes to stretch the Russian air defense system, and then create issues on other parts of the front that aren't Russia's current primary focus. Recently, for example, we talked about the Ukrainian long-range strikes on Moscow. Those and follow-up strikes did by themselves succeed in doing some economic damage. The city's primary oil refinery, for example, is reportedly going to be offline at least through the end of 2026 and potentially into 2027. We also theorised at the time, from a Ukrainian perspective, one of the best results the strike could have is if it caused the Russians to pull even more air defences towards Moscow, because every valuable Panzer or Tor protecting Russian optics in the capital can't be protecting Russian forces elsewhere. And lo and behold, that might be exactly what we've seen. Just between the 19th and 21st of May, for example, 7 new air defence towers were identified being constructed in the north and east of Moscow. Even where towers aren't constructed, we've sometimes seen videos like this one, appearing to show a Panzer being installed by helicopter on the top of a residential apartment building, which might suggest the number of new air defence positions is even greater than the number of towers would suggest. Moscow State University, and coincidentally the building next door where Putin's daughter reportedly works, seems to be in the process of getting a new S-400 battery to protect it. And I think it's reasonable to assume the new positions identified so far might not be the end of the story. Beyond just the effect of stretching Russian air defences, I don't want to dwell too long on the long-range strike component this episode because we've talked about it in the past, but it is worth noting we have seen some recent hits on strategically significant targets, like the one you see in the satellite image here, an electronics facility in Voronezh believed to contribute to the Russian missile industrial base that was explosively renovated apparently by a number of Storm Shadow/Scalp cruise missiles. In other cases, we've seen targets hit at much longer distances by Ukraine's domestically developed systems. That was the case on the right there with the Progress facility in Cheboksary that was hit, with the visual evidence we've got so far suggesting the use of Ukrainian Flamingo cruise missiles. I included this one specifically as an example though to serve as a bit of a reminder and a warning. The image you see on the right there is of the facility, which is critical to the production of things like the Kometa-M jam-resistant antenna that Russia uses extensively in things like its Shahed-style one-way attack drones. And if you just give a casual observer this image, they might understandably conclude that workers generally perform better when they have access to things like roofs and floors, and so production at this facility is probably going to take a hit. But this is a case where details matter. The facility appears to have been attacked by multiple flamingos, not all of them made it through, and the ones that did mostly impacted that building, which is the administration facility. Now, I doubt there'll be no impact on production at the facility, although a cynic might suggest that by blowing up the admin building, the Ukrainians might actually push output higher. But generally speaking, there is going to be all the difference in the world between flattening an admin building and flattening a production facility a few dozen or 100 metres away. There are, however, decently some worrying signs in these recent strikes for the Russians. Not only is the frequency of things like Flamingo cruise missiles being mixed in with the drones apparently up, even if the sample size is small, the data does seem to point to these flocks becoming more dangerous. Flamingos appear to be hitting or nearly hitting their assumed targets more regularly, and images like the one on the right there also seem to suggest they might be capable of flying lower now, something which would potentially make them harder for Russian air defense systems to detect and deal with. Getting back to the Ukrainian mid-strike effort though, and how it fits into this overall campaign, we've seen a couple of target types emphasised. Air defense systems to make it easier for other strikes to get through, mobile logistics vehicles like trucks and trains that make it possible to sustain military activities in an area, and also a pretty significant number of fixed logistics targets. Think port loading facilities, oil storage tanks. And one we've seen more of recently, albeit usually in specific regions, is also local energy targets. Energy facilities like the power substation struck in Crimea on the right there might seem like a bit of an outlier, but part of the intended impact here might be the potential second-order effects. The modern Russian military, like most mechanised forces, runs on fuel, especially diesel. Traditional consumers like trucks and armoured vehicles obviously need it, but so too do frontline dismounted troops. They need to be able to charge and run their communications, their drones, their electronics. And so anything that squeezes fuel availability isn't just a constraint on force mobility, it's a constraint on force combat power. When you have power disruptions in an area, often what happens is a lot of consumers switch over to backup generators. Everyone doing that causes demand for diesel and gasoline to spike, and therein you can see the problem. This is why I mention electrical facilities as more of a niche or localized Ukrainian target. Knocking out a power facility in central Russia isn't going to deliver the Ukrainians a lot of payback relative to the effort required to strike it. It might make people miserable, but without immediate military results. But if you pick an area of military significance relatively close to the front where logistics are already strained, this is just one more way the Ukrainians might put more pressure on already overstretched fuel supply lines. Speaking of which, let's talk about perhaps the exemplar of the current Ukrainian strategy of fighting around the problem, Crimea. As we covered in recent episodes, Crimea in particular, and southern Ukraine in general, so roping in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions as well, had been on the receiving end of a lot of Ukrainian drone resources and also localized ground counterattacks. This is less an area that Russia decided is a priority for offensive activity, and more somewhere that Ukraine has decided to make a problem. Something exemplified by the fact that the Russian governor of Crimea has now declared a state of emergency. A few weeks ago, we talked about a ramp-up, especially in middle and long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russian logistics in the area, and even since then, those have ramped up. Drone strikes have been carried out against additional ferries that Russia uses to cross the Kerch Strait and resupply Crimea from Russia proper. Crimea's ports, loading facilities and coastal radars have been struck repeatedly, and the damage, especially to oil storage infrastructure, has really started to aggregate. As a target type, oil storage tanks are a bit of a weird one. On one hand, you might consider them a bit attacker-friendly, so to speak, because if you give them so much as a reasonably energetic tickle with a one-way attack drone, assuming they're full, those stored hydrocarbons are going to do a lot of the remaining destructive work for you. But in terms of cost or a potential effect on an opponent, an individual oil storage tank isn't a huge deal. From a logistics perspective though, as you begin to lose more and more of them, the value of each one hit starts to compound. Each remaining tank represents a greater share of your remaining storage capacity. And the loss of storage capacity means not just the loss of whatever supply was stored in that tank, it also means you have less buffer and are more reliant on regular, uninterrupted supply. And in Crimea, you can bet the Ukrainians are trying to make sure supply is anything but consistent. In one recent case, for example, that I'll include as a bit of a light-hearted aside, there was a recent case of a Russian military blogger posting on Telegram with a smiley face saying that a large supply of fuel had recently been delivered to Crimea, only for that to be followed shortly thereafter by a Ukrainian strike that hit a large amount of fuel in Crimea, which led to the Ukrainians publicly posting relatively sarcastic thanks to said Russian military blogger. Now, were the Ukrainians actually reliant on a Telegram vague post in order to know that fuel had arrived and do the targeting? I would suggest probably not. But the fact so much flack was thrown around on the Russian side about the incident, I think points to an overall stress point. The fuel situation in Crimea is far from ideal from a Russian perspective, and there's two other pieces of evidence that I think help establish that. One, the Russian authorities there again ostensibly temporarily halted the sale of diesel and petrol to the civilian population, meaning Russians there who wanted to shell out on the black or grey market might have to be ready to hand over the likes of $3 a litre, or for the Americans listening, about $12 a gallon. And for those who couldn't afford or couldn't access those kind of supplies, there was always the longer and longer fuel lines. The last couple of weeks have seen a fair share of videos on social media of Russian tourists in Crimea complaining this isn't exactly the experience they were looking for when they planned their holiday, and we've seen significant traffic around places like the Kerch Bridge heading back towards Russia. To be fair, the fuel situation in Crimea might be particularly tough due to the peninsula's logistical situation, but at this point, most Russian regions have reported at least some fuel sale restrictions, and one Russian official was recently fairly frank about the fact that a lot of this traces back to Ukrainian strikes on refineries. But in Crimea, the issues run deeper than just those burning refineries. Then you have a fight over the logistics links not connecting Russia to Crimea, but instead Crimea and the Donbas to the front lines of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. This is where frequent attacks on things like trucks and trains come in, and even compared to our previous episode on this topic a couple of weeks ago, things do appear to have ramped up. At the time, we were talking about a visually confirmed hit rate of about 20 to 30 Russian trucks and vans being hit per day. More recently, that appears to be closer to 40 a day, 193 visually confirmed hits on Russian trucks and vans over the course of 5 days, with 800 in total since early May being hit more than 20 kilometres from the front line. Now, I think even just that trend in the data by itself is interesting, but digging into the released footage, there's another interesting observation I want to make. Namely, a lot of this footage is good, like unreasonably good. If you look at this footage here, clipped to avoid any un-YouTube-friendly elements, and you'll immediately see this is a long, long way from the PS2 tier resolutions and 90s era latencies we saw in some drones earlier in the war. And yet these are clearly FPV strikes, you can see the rotors, and the geolocations are so far behind the front line, we're talking up to 60 kilometres, that we can probably rule out fibre optics. Which leaves us with the conclusion that, at least in some cases, the Ukrainians are able to operate FPVs at long ranges against Russian supply lines in the south of the country, and they're able to do so maintaining a very good quality connection, which probably correlates with improved hit rates. I'd also note that even though the number of visually confirmed hits has spiked significantly, there is still a massive gap between what we're seeing and what the Ukrainians are publicly claiming. We've gotten to the point now where with some system categories, like tanks, there's usually not an enormous gap between what the Ukrainians are claiming destroyed and what's visually confirmed destroyed. With vehicles and fuel trucks though, the gap is still about 10 to 1. We're seeing about 40 trucks destroyed per day in the visual evidence, the Ukrainians are claiming 400 plus. So to an extent, I'd argue that just how bad the squeeze on Russian logistics in the south becomes really depends on where the true number is. Between the floor estimate, which is how many we visually see hit, and the soft upper estimate, which is how many the Ukrainians claim. It's probably fair to say both that footage isn't released of 100% of strikes, and also that forces at war tend to exaggerate enemy losses. Where that leaves the actual number within that range, we can't be entirely sure. But before we move on, there is one last data clue to add. The Ukrainian E-point system that rewards units who can prove the destruction of Russian targets with points they can exchange for more equipment recently released its aggregates for the month of May. That didn't show any claimed increase in the number of Russian personnel being hit, but the number of strikes happening more than 50 kilometres from the front line doubled compared to April, and the number of UGV logistics and evacuations missions, because those earn points as well, increased by about 40%, which I think provides one extra piece of evidence of Ukraine trying to harden their own supply lines while aggressively going after Russian ones. Then, as well as the trucks themselves, we've got a sequel to an old 2022 classic, the Battle of the Bridges. You'll remember a couple of episodes back I said that if Ukraine's drone capabilities continue to mature and it's able to scale up in the south, one of the things we might eventually expect them to start doing is going after the bridges connecting Crimea to Ukraine proper in a big way. Well, it turns out eventually ended up meaning a couple of weeks. We've seen visual evidence of strike after strike, not just on the bridges connecting Crimea to the rest of Ukraine, but also bridges within Crimea itself and across Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. This isn't just something the Ukrainians are claiming, we've often got satellite images and even statements by Russian officials to back it up. I think it's fair to say this bridge is fair-munted for the immediate future, for example, while in this case the Ukrainians appear to have scored a bit of a 2-for-1, successfully collapsing a road bridge onto a rail link, leaving both a bit of a non-factor, at least for the immediate future. Just looking at that potential choke point we've talked about in the past, connecting Crimea to the rest of Ukraine, the map on the right there shows just 6 of the bridges that have been hit, from west to east. The number of hits and amount of damage being done obviously varies by location, but when you see this many related targets being hit in rapid succession, I think it's fairly safe to assume you're not dealing with opportunistic targeting or coincidence, but instead a deliberate effort. Now, what's particularly interesting to observe here is this is not the first time the Ukrainians or the Russians have chosen to focus on bridges. All the way back in 2022, for example, going after a particular Russian bridge was a major apparent part of the Ukrainian strategy in the Kherson region. At that point, and at numerous other points in this war, it hasn't always proven particularly decisive. And I want to show you an image that illustrates part of the reason why, and also why things may now have partly changed. This is a picture of the Henichesk Bridge, so connecting the northeastern corner of Crimea to the mainland, and I think it highlights some of the problems Ukraine has historically faced going after Russian-controlled bridges. Step 1, you punch some holes in the primary bridge itself. As you can see, that step has been accomplished here. It was also accomplished back in 2022 using things like Storm Shadow, but as you can see, while it's possible to make a bridge partly or fully temporarily impassable using these kind of munitions, actually causing them to collapse beyond the point where they can be repaired is much more difficult. So, unless you're actually able to comprehensively destroy the thing, you end up using expensive munitions as asphalt hole punches that are eventually at least partially repaired. And you may not even get a total temporary stop to traffic because the Russian engineers can step in, as they visibly have here, and set up a pontoon bridge. You can see it on the left. Those can't handle as much traffic, vehicles can't move as quickly, and there are going to be restrictions on how heavily loaded they can be. But if you're just using expensive cruise missiles, pontoon bridges do raise a problem. They're fairly cheap, and you can't really afford to keep slinging cruise missiles into them, only for the Russians to repair them and have another one going within a day or two. In extremis, and given enough time, they might even do something like you see on the right-hand side there, where you just pile up a crap ton of earth to bridge most of the gap. As advanced and capable as modern weapons have become, against a lot of things, including top-end cruise missiles, dirt remains a fairly compelling counter. The difference in 2026, though, is long and mid-range strike is often handled by a high-low mix of munitions. The Ukrainians still have some capable air-launched cruise missiles, for example, but a lot of this work is being done by comparatively more affordable drones. And what that means, economically speaking, is pontoons are on the menu. We've seen images and video like the one on the right there of these mid and long-range strike drones being used to hit traffic travelling over pontoon bridges or to try and knock out the bridges themselves. In that case, you can visibly see the concrete barriers telling traffic, hey, don't go on the regular bridge, go over the pontoon instead, but I dare say the burning truck and scorch marks might scare people off there as well. So with large numbers of more affordable strike drones now available to complement the remaining missiles, it's possible these pontoon bridges won't be able to rely on economics as much of an ironclad defence. And even where Ukraine doesn't decide to target the bridges themselves, traffic over them is a potential opportunity. As a general rule, especially if you don't schedule traffic very carefully, pontoon bridges can cause issues. Especially if you're dealing with a high traffic area, you can potentially end up with vehicles bunched up and waiting to cross, which can potentially provide easy targets. Even if traffic is properly scheduled and you don't have that accumulation, the vehicles crossing themselves have a defensive problem. Driving across a narrow pathway, in the open, with a speed limit that's going to make your average school zone look like the Silverstone GP. And so we've seen cases like the one you can see on the right there, of drones apparently monitoring these bridges and striking trucks as they attempt to cross, which not only offers the truck itself as a comparatively low-speed target, it also, if the drone is successful, means you may temporarily block the bridge until the wreckage can be cleared out of the way. This is another area where the capabilities of the forces in 2026 differs so much from 2022 or 2023. Choke points like this are easier to monitor, and there are more weapons available to potentially strike them. A worst-case scenario for Russia then might be Ukraine getting to the point with their drone force relative to Russian air defences, where the Ukrainians can do to some of these critical bridges something similar to what Russia's Rubicon did to the road to Sudzha back during the Kursk offensive. Place a section under as close to full-time monitoring as possible, and then make sure enough drones are being launched against it regularly enough to make traffic unacceptably risky. And given we now have cases of even FPVs being able to range out 60-odd kilometres from their launch point and maintain good connection, there are an increasing number of tools available to interdict not just the supply vehicles themselves, but also other supporting elements. Think engineering vehicles, for example, excavators or cranes, the stuff you might have to bring in to make repairs, or clear debris and rubble in the case of something like a train derailment, for example. The core point here is that while Russia has often been at its most effective choking off Ukrainian supply to frontline positions in critical sections of the front, the apparent Ukrainian approach here is to try and create major logistical issues for the Russians on a section of the front that isn't their primary priority. Because if you're able to create localised or regional shortages, break down transportation networks, the logic might go they can make it harder and harder for the Russians to defend the targets that are left, and also for the Russian positions in situ to hold without additional resources or reinforcements. I think there is decent odds this Ukrainian flag we recently saw raised on the Kinburn split was dropped by a drone, but the more degraded the supply situation becomes in some of these areas, potentially the more fragile the front line might be, giving an opportunity for the Ukrainians to poke and potentially force the Russians to pay more attention and allocate additional resources. A rough summary of some of the dynamics we're currently seeing then might go something like this. This is not really a case of one side, the Russians, having a monopoly over the initiative and being able to dictate exactly when and how the battles we fought. The Russians still get to choose the place or places where they put the main thrust of their effort. And where Russia decides to dedicate those kind of resources, the Ukrainians are forced to respond and potentially continue to give up territory. Ukraine's so-called mid-strike revolution hasn't robbed Russia of a lot of its typical advantages. They still have more available manpower, a significant advantage especially in air-delivered fires, and Russian drone units are generally very dangerous and often capable of commanding quantitative superiority over parts of the front. But attacking Ukraine, including using those Russian methods, is often a very, very difficult, expensive exercise, and Ukrainian adaptations appear to have made it even more so. Especially where the Russians are pushing the hardest, the Ukrainian situation is still often very difficult, and their force is still tired, stretched, and under pressure. But by most metrics so far, the front line does appear to be more stable than it was back in 2025. And far from just reacting to Russian attacks, the Ukrainians have been able to launch a campaign or campaigns of their own. Their focus appears to be more on trying to keep the front line as stable as possible, but then inflicting the maximum amount of damage beyond it, going after the Russian war economy, defence production, and also politically significant targets like Moscow or Crimea that, if threatened, might force Russia to respond in certain ways. To put it in polite terms from a Russian perspective, the current logistical situation in Crimea is deeply suboptimal. And while there are plenty of adaptations the Russians can and are likely to make, it may well be the situation gets worse before it gets better. And sitting in the background of this calculus is that as some of these logistics links become more squeezed or cut off entirely, the peninsula and the supply lines connected to it become more and more reliant on the links that do remain, chief of which is the Kerch Strait Bridge. You'll remember I've said in the past that the public narrative around the war has sometimes tended to overemphasise the importance of this thing, but I think it's fair to say now that as other road, rail and maritime links become increasingly problematic for the Russians, the state of the bridge becomes a more and more strategic concern. So I think we can expect the Russians to sink everything they can into making sure they defend it, while I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians took another shot or 10 at potentially hitting it. Both the campaign in Crimea and the strikes further into Russia are all arguably part of the same Ukrainian strategic effort. A way to make it more likely the Russians will feel compelled to come back to the table in a serious way by stacking up the cost of the war in a way that makes it very difficult for the Russian public to ignore. The Russian Ministry of Defence can and does largely continue to publish a bunch of info saying that essentially the special military operation is going great. They can claim sky-high Ukrainian and NATO casualties, minimise the Russian ones, but it's much, much harder for them to force Russians not to notice that there are missiles and drones flying overhead, things are exploding, and on a completely unrelated note, there are now restrictions on buying gasoline. Russians are going to notice that borrowing costs are up, fuel availability is down, and even members of the Russian population that pay basically no attention to any kind of media will still notice if at any point they're invited to pay a price that, purchasing power parity adjusted, might be equivalent to asking Americans to fork out $15 or $20+ a gallon. It may not be the kind of thing that necessarily collapses public support or a war effort, but it is the kind of thing that's difficult to hide. It may also be there's been a bit of a tone shift in parts of the Russian media. Less triumphalism about inevitable military victory, more complaints about strikes, and even some public fretting about the future of Crimea. Of course, none of this guarantees a change in decision-making by the Kremlin. Russia is a country with immense resources and a lot of capacity to absorb punishment, the same way the Ukrainians have on the other side. But if the Kremlin's risk and pain tolerance was infinite, you can imagine they might have taken steps like declaring an additional mobilisation a long time ago, nor would they feel the need for Russia's sky-high internal security budget. And so the Ukrainians might be hoping that eventually the combination of enough economic pain inflicted, coupled with a slow enough rate of advance at the front, might be enough to compel the Russians to change tack. But until or if that moment arrives, the adaptation race continues. For Russia to try and regenerate some momentum and take the territorial objectives they've set, for the Ukrainians to keep the front line as stable as possible while ramping up the damage and chaos behind it. In the first half of this year, the Ukrainians have arguably pulled the balance more back in their favour than in the equivalent period of 2025, and only time will now tell how things play out in the rest of 2026. And okay, very brief channel update to close out. First things first, I wasn't originally going to do another update on the progress of this campaign season so soon, but given how quickly some of these elements like mid-range strike have been scaling up, I thought it was worth highlighting some of the good and bad news from both sides' perspective before we move into the second half of the year. Over the next couple of weeks, my plan is to bring some of the more data-centric elements front and centre, so we can contextualise some of the elements we've talked about today, like long-range strikes, interdiction and frontline movements, with some of the economic and military-focused datasets that might help us better project things like future impacts and sustainability. In the interest of saving my voice, I'll hold any other updates over until next week, so let me just say in closing, thank you very much all of you for watching as always, and with any luck, I'll see you all again next week.